What would you have done if you'd have been handed a list of children S names and told that without your help, every one of them would disappear? I never saw myself as a hero. I was a stockbroker, a man who liked order, quiet evenings and chess. But in December 1938, chaos walked into my life wearing the face of a child. My name is Nicholas Winton. And though the world only learned what I did decades later, I've carried those 669 names with me every day since. Not as glory, but as a quiet duty fulfilled. It began with a cancelled holiday. I was meant to be skiing in Switzerland, but my friend Martin Blake called from Prague, his voice urgent. "Come, there's something you must see." I hesitated. Prague wasn't my concern, but something in his tone pulled me east. What I found shattered my detachment. Refugees filled the streets. Families who'd fled the Sudetenland after the Munich Agreement handed it to Hitler. They'd lost homes, citizenship, hope. And now, with German troops gathering, they knew time was running out. Martin took me to a makeshift shelter. The silence there wasn't empty, it was heavy. A mother clutched her son like a prayer. An old man stared at his hands as if they'd failed him, and the children, their eyes held a fear no child should know. That night, over tea, Martin and Doreen Warrener explained, Britain had launched the Kindertransport for German and Austrian Jewish children, but Czechoslovakia had been forgotten. No system, no trains, just parents willing to send their children away, alone, if it meant survival. I sat there thinking, this isn't my problem. I had a job in London, no authority, no mandate. But then I pictured my nieces, safe in their beds, and asked myself, what if it were them? So I said, let me try. I rented a room at the Europa Hotel and turned it into an office. I gathered names, birth dates, photos, consent forms. Each child needed a British sponsor and a $50 guarantee. I wrote letters, hundreds, to officials, charities, strangers. The Home Office moved slowly. The Czech authorities were overwhelmed. Every day the danger grew. But I knew how to organize. At the stock exchange, I managed complex trades with precision. Now I applied that same discipline to rescue. When I returned to London in January 1939, my mother, Babette, became my ally. Without question, she helped place ads. Czech children in need of homes. Please help. Replies trickled in. A school teacher in Devon, a Quaker family in Yorkshire, a widow in Manchester. I have no children, one woman wrote. Let me love one of yours. I typed each offer into a ledger, the most sacred document I've ever kept. Next to every sponsor, I'd write a child's name once matched. It felt like stitching hope back together, one thread at a time. But the real test came with the Germans. By March 1939, occupation was imminent. Exit permits were now controlled by the Gestapo. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid, but fear doesn't fill train carriages. So I negotiated, using charm, persistence, sometimes bending rules. I adjusted birth dates to keep children under 17. I listed temporary sponsors when real ones were scarce. I even paid bribes with my own savings. What was money compared to a life? The first train left Prague on March 14, 1939, one day before German troops marched in. 20 children boarded, clutching small suitcases and stuffed animals. One little girl, Eva, turned and waved. I waved back and silently promised, I will not let you down. They crossed Germany, then Holland, then sailed to Harwich. In London, foster families waited at Liverpool Street Station. I met them myself, checked names against my list and wrote, Train 120 children arrived safely. Over the next months, 7 more trains followed, 25 children, 50, once 112. I coordinated everything from my London office, often working late after my day job. My colleagues never knew. To them, I was just Nick Winton, the quiet broker who never missed a deadline. But behind closed doors, I was building an ark. By August 1939, I'd placed 669 children in British homes. Each had a name, a story, a face I'd never forget. Then, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. All civilian trains stopped. The 9th train, the last, was scheduled to leave Prague that morning. 250 children stood on the platform, tickets in hand, parents weeping nearby. But German soldiers blocked the station. The train never departed. I learned of it days later. I sat at my desk, staring at those 250 names, and wept quietly into my hands. I saved 669, but the ones I couldn't save haunted me more. After that, I put the ledgers away. I joined the RAF. I married Greta. We raised 3 children. I never spoke of Prague, not out of shame, but because it didn't feel like something to boast about. It was simply what needed doing. If I hadn't done it, who would have? For nearly 50 years, those names stayed in a box in my attic. My wife didn't know. My children didn't know. The world moved on, and so did I. But memory has a way of returning. In 1988, Greta found the scrapbook while cleaning. She showed it to a researcher, then a journalist. Then one day, I sat in a television studio, surrounded by strangers who kept looking at me with tears in their eyes. I didn't understand until they spoke. "My name is Vera," said a woman. "You saved me in 1939. "I'm Joe," said a man beside her. "I was on train 4. Then they stood, dozens of them now in their 50s, with children of their own, lives built on the chance I'd given them. They rose as one, and the room filled with applause, not for a hero, but for a promise kept. But that's later. For now, all you need to know is this. I was never special. I was just a man who saw a problem and refused to look away. And if there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. You don't need to be extraordinary to do extraordinary good. You just need to begin. Because sometimes all it takes is one person with a list and the will to act. The war changed everything, and yet in some ways it changed nothing at all. While bombs fell on London and cities burned across Europe, I carried on as best I could. I joined the Royal Air Force in 1940, serving first in administration and later in intelligence. My days were filled with reports, briefings, and the grim arithmetic of total war. But at night, when the air raid sirens wailed and the sky turned orange, I'd sometimes lie awake, thinking of those 669 children, scattered now across Britain, sleeping in strangers' homes, learning new accents, trying to forget the sound of their mothers' last goodbyes. I never expected to hear from them again, and for a long time I didn't. Life moved forward, as it must. After the war, I left the RAF and returned to civilian life. I worked in finance, then in social housing, always drawn to roles where I could quietly improve someone's circumstances. I married Greta in 1940, a kind, steady woman who never asked too many questions about my past. We built a quiet life in Maidenhead, raised 3 children, Robin, Nicholas, and Barbara, and filled our days with school plays, Sunday walks, and the gentle rhythm of ordinary existence. I never spoke of Prague, not because I was ashamed, never that, but because it didn't feel like mine to tell. Those children belonged to their foster families now. They had new names, new lives, and their parents. Well, I didn't need to say it aloud to know what had likely happened. By 1945, the full horror of the Holocaust was unfolding in newsreels and newspaper headlines. I read the reports with a heavy heart, recognizing street names, cities, camps. I knew, without needing confirmation, that most of the parents who kissed their children goodbye at Prague as Wilson Station were gone. That knowledge settled inside me like stone. It wasn't guilt, it was responsibility. I had done what I could. But the weight of what I couldn't do, the 250 children on that final train, never left me. I kept their names in a drawer, not as a memorial, but as a reminder. Never again let bureaucracy win over humanity. Years passed, decades even. My children grew up, married, had children of their own. I retired in the early 1970s, content with a life well lived if unremarkable. I volunteered locally, played chess at the club, tended my garden. The world moved on, and so did I. Then, in 1988, everything changed. Greta was cleaning the attic, a task I'd long avoided, when she found an old cardboard box tucked behind a trunk. Inside were my ledgers, photographs, letters, train manifests, and that worn scrapbook I'd kept in Prague. She didn't recognize the names, but she recognized the care with which everything had been preserved. "Nick," she said that evening, holding a faded photo of children boarding a train. "Who are these people?" I told her. Not all at once, but in pieces. Over tea, then dinner, then a long walk the next day. She listened quietly, her eyes filling not with surprise, but with a deep, quiet pride. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" she asked. I shrugged. It wasn't important. But Greta thought otherwise. She showed the scrapbook to a local Holocaust researcher who was stunned. Within weeks, the story reached the BBC. A producer named Esther Ranson called me. She wanted to feature the rescue on her show, That's Life, a popular Sunday evening program known for reuniting long-lost families and uncovering hidden acts of kindness. I agreed, though reluctantly. I didn't want attention, but if it meant honoring those children, I'd do it. What I didn't know was that Esther had spent months tracking down the Winton children. She'd found dozens, now adults in their 50s, living across Britain, Canada, Israel, the United States. Many had spent their lives wondering who'd arranged their escape. Some assumed it had been a large organization. None imagined it was one man, working alone from a hotel room. On the day of filming, I was asked to sit in the audience as a guest. The show began with a segment about a mysterious rescue operation in pre-war Prague. Then Esther turned to the camera and said, "We've located the man who made it all possible. He's here tonight, Mr. Nicholas Winton." The audience clapped politely. I stood, gave a small wave and sat back down. Then Esther said, "But there's something else. Many of the children he saved are also here, with their own children and grandchildren." And that's when they stood. First one woman, Vera Gissing, a writer I'd placed with a family in Surrey. Then Joe Schlesinger, the Canadian journalist who'd arrived on train 4. Then more, dozens of them, rising from their seats, tears streaming, hands over their hearts. The camera panned across faces I hadn't seen since 1939, now lined with age, but still carrying the same eyes I remembered from those train platforms. I tried to stay composed, but when a little girl, no older than 5, walked down the aisle and placed a single red rose in my lap, I broke. I covered my face and wept. Not for myself, but for all the parents who never got to see their children grow up. For the ones on that last train, for the sheer staggering miracle that so many had survived and thrived. After the broadcast, letters poured in, from survivors, from their children, from strangers moved by the story. "You gave us a future," one wrote. "Because of you, I have grandchildren who know joy, not fear." I read each one, but I never kept them. I didn't deserve that kind of gratitude. I'd only done what anyone would have done if they'd bothered to try. But the truth is, most people didn't try. That's what still astonishes me. In 1939, the world saw what was happening and looked away. Governments debated. Bureaucrats delayed. Newspapers printed small paragraphs on back pages, and yet ordinary people could have done more. They should have done more. My story became a symbol, not of heroism, but of possibility. If a stockbroker with no connections, no power, and no mandate could save 669 children, what might others have achieved if they'd acted? In the years that followed, I was invited to schools, to parliaments, to ceremonies. I received honors I never sought, The Czech Republic made me a national hero. Queen Elizabeth knighted me in 2003. I always accepted them on behalf of the volunteers in Prague, the foster families in Britain, the parents who made the unbearable choice to let go. But the greatest honor came quietly. A few years after the BBC broadcast, a woman named Ruth Halova visited me. She'd been 5 when she left Prague. She brought her daughter and 2 grandsons. "This is who you saved," she said, placing her grandson's hand in mine. "And this is who exists because you cared." That's the real legacy. Not medals or headlines, but generations. Still, I often wonder about the ones I couldn't save. The 250 on that final train. I've met historians who've tried to trace them. Most were deported to Theresienstadt, then to Auschwitz. Very few survived. I keep their list close, not to punish myself, but to remember that rescue is never guaranteed. It requires urgency. It demands action now, not later, because history doesn't wait. And if there's one thing I hope you carry from my story, it is this. Goodness isn't the absence of evil, it is the presence of action. You don't need a title, a uniform, or a grand plan. You just need to see someone in need and choose not to look away. After that night on That's Life, my quiet life vanished overnight. One day I was pruning roses in my garden in Maidenhead. The next, I was being interviewed by newspapers from Tokyo to Toronto. The British Schindler, they called me, a label I always resisted. Oskar Schindler risked everything, spent his fortune, defied the SS. I filled out forms, booked train tickets, and wrote letters. There's no comparison. But the world needed a story of hope in the shadow of the Holocaust, and somehow I became part of it. Still, I couldn't ignore the letters. They kept coming, hundreds, then thousands, from a teacher in Toronto who'd been on train 3. "Because of you, I taught history for 40 years, so my students would never forget." From a doctor in Tel Aviv, "I delivered over 2,000 babies. None of them would exist without your courage." One envelope contained a single pressed flower and a note. "My mother kissed this and put it in my pocket the day I left Prague. I kept it all my life. Now I send it to you, the man who gave me back my future." I read each one at my kitchen table, often with Greta beside me, her hand resting on mine. She never tired of hearing their stories. "You gave them life, Nick," she'd say. "Let them thank you." But gratitude wasn't what I wanted. What I needed, was to know they were all right, that they'd found joy, built families, lived without fear. And they had. More than that, they'd become teachers, scientists, artists, grandparents. One even became a member of Parliament in Canada. Their lives were proof that kindness, however small, ripples outward across time. Then came the invitations. First, from the Czech Republic. In 1991, President Václav Havel invited me to Prague, a city I hadn't seen since 1939. I was hesitant. So much had changed, so much had been lost, but Greta insisted. "You owe it to them," she said, "and to yourself." The moment I stepped off the plane, I was overwhelmed. At the airport, a crowd waited, not reporters, but survivors. Men and women in their 60s holding signs with their childhood names. Train 5, child number 112. Thank you, Mr. Winton. At the hotel, the staff lined the hallway and applauded as I walked in. I felt like an imposter. I hadn't done anything grand. I just acted. The next day, I visited the old Wilson station. The very platform where I'd stood in 1939 watching children board trains to safety. A memorial now stood there, a bronze statue of a child holding a suitcase, gazing toward the tracks. But the most moving moment came when I met a group of school children. They'd studied my story in class. One boy raised his hand and asked, "Why did you do it?" I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because it felt too simple. "Because it was right," I said, "and because no one else was doing it." Later, President Havel awarded me the Order of the White Lion, the Czech Republic's highest honor. During the ceremony, he said something I'll never forget. While the world was silent, one man listened to the cries of children and answered. But the truth is, I didn't act alone. Back in 1938, I had help. Brave Czech volunteers, many of them Jewish, who risked their lives to gather names, forge documents, and comfort terrified families. One woman, Marie Schmolke, worked tirelessly with Doreen Warriner until she fled to London. Another, Trevor Chadwick, a British teacher who stayed in Prague after I returned to London, personally escorted several trains, even bluffing his way past Gestapo officers with nothing but charm and a fake British passport. He never sought recognition. He died in obscurity in 1973. I wish the world knew his name. That's the thing about rescue. It's never just one person. It's a chain of quiet courage, each link holding the next. Back in Britain, my story began to enter classrooms. Teachers used it to show students that ordinary people can change history. I visited schools whenever I could, though I always insisted on one rule: no applause. Don't clap for me, I'd tell them. Go home and do something kind. That's how you honor this story. Children would ask the same questions. Were you scared? Yes. Did you think you'd fail? Every day. Would you do it again? In a heartbeat. But the question that haunted me came from a teenager in Manchester. Why didn't more people help? I didn't have a good answer then. I still don't. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps indifference. Perhaps the belief that someone else would step in. But I've always believed that evil doesn't win because good people are weak. It wins because they wait. In 1999, something extraordinary happened. A group of British schoolchildren, inspired by my story, launched a campaign to build a memorial at Liverpool Street Station, the place where the Kindertransport children first arrived in Britain. They raised funds, designed the statue, and lobbied the city council. The result was Kindertransport the Arrival, a bronze sculpture of 5 children and a guardian unveiled in 2006. I was there, leaning on my cane, watching as survivors touched the faces of the statues, some weeping, some smiling. But the most unexpected turn came in 2009, 70 years after the last train. A woman named Ruth Barnett, who'd been on train 2, tracked down the original passenger list of the final doomed train, the one that never left Prague. With the help of historians, she identified dozens of the 250 children. Some had miraculously survived, hidden in convents, adopted by non-Jewish families, or liberated from camps. A few were still alive. One of them, a man named Paul Peters, lived in London. He'd been 4 years old in 1939. His parents had put him on the platform, kissed him goodbye, and vanished into the Holocaust. Paul was later hidden by a Czech farmer, then adopted after the war. He'd spent his life wondering why he'd been left behind, until Ruth found him. When he learned I'd tried to save him, he wrote to me. For 70 years, I thought I was forgotten, he said. Now, I know someone fought for me. We met at my home. He was in his 70s, with gentle eyes and a quiet voice. We sat in the garden, sipping tea, talking about Prague, about loss, about second chances. Before he left, he took my hand and said, "You didn't fail us, Mr. Winton. You gave us a chance, and some of us took it." That moment healed something in me I didn't know was broken. As I grew older, I often reflected on the nature of legacy. I never wanted statues or titles. What mattered was that those 669 lives and the thousands who came after them were living proof that compassion can outlast hatred. My children, my grandchildren, and now my great-grandchildren carry that truth forward, not as a burden, but as a quiet inheritance. And if you ever doubt that one person can make a difference, just look at the faces of the Winton children, now elders themselves, surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. Multiply that by 669. Multiply it again by the lives they've touched. That's not heroism, that's humanity, and it begins with a single choice: to act. Time has a way of softening edges, but never the truth. As I entered my 90s, I found myself thinking less about trains and ledgers and more about silence, why we keep it, when we break it, and what it costs us to speak. For 50 years, I said nothing about Prague, not out of shame, not out of modesty, but because the act itself felt complete. The children were safe. That was enough. But once the story was out, I realized silence can also be a kind of erasure. By not speaking, I'd let the world forget how close we came to losing them all, and how easily it could happen again. In the early 2000s, I began receiving invitations from places I'd never imagined. Schools in Berlin, museums in Washington, even a human rights conference in Geneva. At first, I declined most. I was old, my knees ached, and I preferred my armchair to airport terminals. But then I met a young teacher from Birmingham named Louise. She'd brought her students to visit me after studying the Kindertransport in class. One girl, no older than 12, asked, "Mr. Winton, do you think something like the Holocaust could happen today?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at their faces, earnest, worried, full of the kind of hope that only young people carry, and I knew I couldn't hide behind silence anymore. "It's already happening," I said gently. "Not in the same way, not with trains and camps, but children are still fleeing war, still separated from their families, still waiting for someone to care." That conversation changed me. I started saying yes. Yes to the schools, yes to the documentaries, yes to the students who wrote letters, asking how to be brave. I told them the same thing I tell you now. Bravery is in the absence of fear. It's doing what's right while your hands are shaking. One of the most profound moments came in 2007, when I was invited to speak at the Czech Senate. I stood in the very chamber where, decades earlier, democracy had been dismantled, and now here I was, an old Englishman, being honored as a righteous among the nations by the Czech people. But what moved me most wasn't the ceremony. It was the group of teenagers who waited outside the building afterward, holding handmade signs, "Thank you for seeing us when the world looked away." They weren't survivors. They weren't even Jewish. They were just children who understood that history isn't just about the past, it is a mirror. Back home, my own family began to see me differently. My grandchildren, who'd grown up thinking of me as Grandpa Nick, the quiet one who liked jam sandwiches and crosswords, now asked questions. "Did you ever meet any of the parents again?" my granddaughter Emily asked one Sunday lunch. I shook my head. Almost none. A few wrote letters before the borders closed. One mother sent a photo of her son, my age now, with a note, "He looks like you. Thank you for being his eyes when I could not." I kept that photo in my wallet for years. I still have it. But the past doesn't just live in objects, it lives in choices. And in 2012, I faced a choice that brought everything full circle. A group of activists contacted me about a new crisis. Unaccompanied refugee children arriving in Calais, stranded in makeshift camps, with no legal pathway to safety in Britain. The parallels were chilling. Same desperation, same bureaucratic delays, same question, who will help them? I was 103 years old. I couldn't organize trains anymore, but I could lend my name. So I did. I signed letters. I recorded a short message, my voice thin but steady, urging the British government to act. "I saved 669 children," I said, "but I could have saved more if people had listened sooner. Don't make the same mistake twice." The campaign sparked debate. Some called it inappropriate to compare past and present. But I've always believed that compassion isn't bound by time. A child in need is a child in need, whether in 1939 or 2012. Around that time, a documentary filmmaker asked me, "Do you ever regret not doing more?" I thought for a long moment. "Regret isn't useful," I said, "but memory is. I remember the faces I couldn't save, so I never stopped believing that action matters." That belief was tested one last time in 2014. A train company in the Czech Republic decided to honor me by naming a high-speed train the Winton train. They invited me to Prague for the unveiling. At 105, travel was difficult, but Greta, who'd passed in 1999, would have wanted me to go. So I went. On the day of the ceremony, something miraculous happened. As the sleek, modern train pulled into the station, a group of school children boarded, not as passengers, but as a living tribute. Each carried a small suitcase, just like the children in 1939. But inside weren't clothes or toys. They carried letters, written by Czech students to refugee children in Syria, in South Sudan, in Myanmar. Messages of hope, promises of solidarity. I watched from a wheelchair, tears in my eyes, as the train departed, not to escape, but to connect. Later, a reporter asked, "Mr. Winton, what do you want your legacy to be?" I smiled. "I don't want a legacy. I want a lesson. The lesson is this: when you see suffering, don't wait for permission to help. Don't wait for a committee. Don't wait for someone more important to step forward. Just begin." Because here is what I learned in that hotel room in Prague all those years ago. Evil thrives not in the hearts of monsters, but in the silence of ordinary people who think their voice doesn't matter. But it does. Every single time. And long after I'm gone, as long as one child chooses kindness over indifference, as long as one person sees a stranger's pain and says, "I'll try," then the trains never really stop running. They just change direction toward hope. There comes a time in every life when you stop looking ahead and start looking back, not with regret, but with reckoning. By the time I turned 106, I knew my days were numbered. My body had slowed, my steps had grown careful, but my mind remained clear, especially when it came to those 669 faces. They never left me. Not in dreams, not in quiet moments, not even in the hush of Sunday mornings, when the house was still and the world felt far away. I often sat by the window in my study, the same room where I'd typed out train manifests and sponsor lists all those decades ago. Now, the ledgers were in museums, the photographs framed in schools, my name spoken in ceremonies I never attended. But the truth remained unchanged. I was just a man who saw a problem and refused to look away. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you as this story closes, it's that ordinary people are the true architects of change. Not generals, not politicians, but teachers, clerks, mothers, students, people like you. In my final years, I received one last gift, one I never expected. A young filmmaker named Matej brought his daughter to visit me. She was 7 years old, with bright eyes and a backpack covered in stars. She handed me a drawing, a train winding through green hills, children waving from the windows, and a small figure on the platform labeled Mr. Winton. On the back she'd written, "Thank you for making the world kinder." I kept that drawing on my bedside table until the end, because that's what it was always about. Not numbers, not trains, not even survival. It was about kindness. The kind that doesn't ask for credit. The kind that acts before it's asked. The kind that believes a single life is worth moving mountains for. I've been called a hero more times than I can count, but I've always said heroes wear capes in stories. In real life, they wear overcoats, carry briefcases, and go to work on the tube. They're the ones who notice when someone's drowning and throw a rope, even if they've never met them. And yes, I failed too. The 250 children on that last train, those names still ache in my bones, but I've made peace with that. Not because I stopped caring, but because I learned that rescue isn't about perfection. It's about presence, showing up, doing what you can, while you can. When I look at the world today, I see both shadows and light. There are still children fleeing war, still families torn apart by hatred, still governments turning away from suffering. But there are also people, countless quiet people who open their homes, sign petitions, donate, speak up. They may never make headlines, but they are the inheritors of that same spirit that moved me in 1938. And that gives me hope. My own family has grown in ways I never imagined. My children, my grandchildren, and now my great-grandchildren carry forward a simple belief that decency is not optional, it's essential. At family gatherings, we don't talk about honors or history. We talk about how to be good, how to listen, how to act. In 2015, just weeks before my 106th birthday, I was honored with a special ceremony at Prague's main railway station. They unveiled a larger-than-life statue of me, not as a young man, but as the elder I'd become, seated on a bench, suitcase beside me, gazing toward the tracks. But the most moving part, they placed real suitcases around the statue, each one filled with letters from school children across Europe, addressed to the children of tomorrow. Messages of peace, promises to remember, vows to protect the vulnerable. I couldn't attend in person, but I watched the live stream from my living room. As the camera panned over the crowd, survivors, their children, students, strangers, I whispered to myself, it was worth it. Every sleepless night, every forged document, every tear on that platform. Worth it. I died peacefully on July 1st, 2015, just weeks after that ceremony, just days after watching my great-granddaughter take her first steps. I was surrounded by family, by love, and by the quiet certainty that I'd done what I could with the time I was given. But my story didn't end with me. Today, the Winton children number in the thousands. Children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren of those 669 souls. They live in London, Toronto, Tel Aviv, Sydney, Prague. They are doctors, teachers, artists, engineers, grandparents. They gather every few years for reunions, not to mourn, but to celebrate, a living testament to the power of one person's choice. And every time a student learns about the Kindertransport, every time a refugee is welcomed into a new home, every time someone chooses empathy over indifference, my work continues, not because of me, but because of you. So as this story comes to a close, I leave you with this final thought, spoken not as a hero, but as a fellow human being who once stood on a cold platform in Prague and chose to care. Don't wait for history to call your name. Call it yourself, because the next train is always coming, and someone, maybe you, has to be there to meet it.